Hi there again, everyone. My usual introduction here for our weekly webinars. We're very fortunate today to have Heidi from Reality HR who's going to do a fantastic presentation on managing a hybrid team and this modern way of working that we're all going to have to adapt to moving forward. For those that don't know, we're a Kickstart gateway. For those who aren't involved in the Kickstart scheme or don't know about it, it's a brilliant government initiative to get people back into work that have been made redundant as part of the pandemic or have come out of university or college or whatever into one of the worst jobs markets on record, despite there being lots of supposed places for them to be employed. But it's a great benefit for businesses. They can use it to bounce back and take the kind of risk out of taking new people on, because it's always a big. Heidi's nodding along there at the risk of taking new people on, and I'm sure lots of your advice to your clients is along that, how to do it right and then what to do if you've not got it right and all those sorts of things. So it's a great scheme in general. We're seeing some fantastic success with graduates like Sahira and people like that who are getting their first opportunity as part of the scheme. It's, it isn't perfect, and I hear some negative things on social media, but that's often due to the speed of it, due to the slowness of the DWP sometimes, and also if people haven't had good support from a good gateway in terms of guiding them as an employer or helping their employees. So I'll hand over to Heidi now to do a much better introduction of herself than I can. So over to you, Heidi.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. I'm really pleased to be here talking to you today. Whether you're live with us or watching on Catch Up, welcome. I hope the next hour is going to be interesting and useful for anyone who's thinking about how they're going to structure their workforce going forward. Whether your workforce is 1 or 100, the new way of working, as Mark says, the way that we're going to see the future of work is changing and changing dramatically. So hopefully I've got some high-level points for you, some things to consider, some tips to help you. We're going to cover all sorts of things in the hour. Most of it around performance management, because actually the way we set performance standards, the way we set work standards, and the way we manage when those are met or not met is really a fundamental part of managing a team of people or an individual. And I'm going to talk through in quite a lot of detail really about how we can do that setting standards piece well. What sorts of standards and expectations are right? How do we know what to ask for people? How do we then communicate those standards and expectations? How do we measure the output? How do we know if the standards are met or not met? And then how do we deal with it if we've got an issue? As Mark says, the risk of taking someone new on can be mitigated a lot if you go through a good induction process where you're really clear about what your expectations are from the person, and you give them regular feedback, and they have the mechanisms to be able to measure, are they meeting your requirements, your standards or not? And if they're not meeting, do they know how to then get back on track? So like I say, a lot of the session today around hybrid working, although we are thinking about the different ways of the workforce, are we working from home, or we're working in an office, are we a blend? Actually, the fundamental parts of managing a team are very similar, no matter whether we're all in the office together or whether we're at other ends of the country and we only talk on Zoom. So the whole piece around performance management, and then also we're going to touch on managing or supporting team members' well-being. Really, they're fundamentals of good management that cross industries, cross size of business, across sectors. It doesn't really matter where you're working or the size of the team you're managing. Hopefully the points I want to cover with you today, you will find useful and be able to take some tips straight away and things you can do immediately. Now, obviously, we'll share the presentation with you if you wanted a copy of the presentation. You'd be very welcome to that. And at the end of the session, I will share my contact details so you can get in touch back with Mark via Sports Professionals, or you can come straight to us. So let's get cracking. I'm conscious of the time. I always try and put too much in an hour. So if I run out of time towards the end, I'll just speed up my chat a little bit. Now, We haven't got very many people live, so I was going to say you're obviously very welcome to put any questions into the chat, and I will try and answer them as we go or come back to them at the end. But otherwise, I'll save some time at the end for questions. And those of you that are watching on catch up, please do, if you've got questions or want anything clarifying that I've covered, please do get in touch. As I say, my contact details will be available for you. So what do we need to think about when we're looking at hybrid teams? As I say, lots about performance, managing underperformance, lots about setting expectations. I've mentioned the word communication already a couple of times during this session. We've been on, 7 minutes, and I've mentioned communication a couple of times already, because that is the foundation of all management, isn't it? How do you communicate with your team members? How often? Through what medium? And using what words, what language? So it's not just the format that we're sending our communication through, but it's also, are we speaking in a language that they understand? Are we using jargon that they don't know what it means? Are we not explaining what to us? It's obvious. We've done our jobs for a long time. It's so obvious to us. It doesn't need explanation. But what we've got to remember is someone, especially someone new into our companies, into our organisations, will need extra communication. And of course, anyone who's working remotely needs communication about the job and about all of these things on the screen, but also for engagement, for morale, for team building, to actually feel part of the company. If you're working from your spare room or your lounge, your dining room table, it's very difficult to feel that you're part of a team. So I've got some ideas that we're going to cover off about how you can encourage that team morale and engagement as well. So the first thing I mentioned, I think, was setting expectations. And I think the really important part when you're considering any sort of hybrid working is to understand, what do your team members want? What types of work patterns do they prefer? What do they need around their personal lives? We're still in restrictions through the pandemic to a certain extent. So what do they need from you? And then thinking, what do you need from them? And how can we find that compromise, if you will? How do we find the working patterns, the working schedules that balance what the business needs and what that individual prefers? Now, some people will want to be in an office full time. Some people will want to work remotely full time. Some will want a mixture. Some will want a team together, some prefer to work alone. So understanding what each of those people is after is really key to getting a format and a function that's going to work in the long term. So it's all well and good as an organisation saying, we want everyone in the office every day, 9 till 5. But actually, over the last 18 months, haven't a lot of us proved that it works to work from home? So I'm in my home office here. I'm sure that's Mark's home behind him there as well. So we've proved that we don't have to be together in an office to make it work. But maybe you do have to be together some of the time. Maybe the roles are frontline roles. They actually have to be in a school, with the kids they're teaching, or they're in a shop serving the customers. So some roles obviously don't have the same amount of flexibility. So the key here is to understand what flexibility you can put in for individuals and what are they looking for, to, as closely as you can, set up that process where it's going to work for both parties. Now, if you've got a team that's bigger than just you and a member of staff, if you've got a number of people in your team, you have to balance all of their needs to make sure you've got cover where and when you need it. So a departmental plan, so a company plan. Who do you need working when? Who's working core hours? Who has more flexibility in their hours? Let's have a shared calendar so we all know who's working where and when, who's in the office, who's out on site, who's working from home, so that it's really clear and everyone knows what's expected of them. And I've got a couple of points here. Will people working remotely or working from home be expected to observe core hours or strict office hours? And will they be required to account for their time? Do you use a clocking in and out system? Will they be required to account for every minute that they've worked? Or actually, can you allow a slightly more autonomous way of working where you're measuring output more than you're measuring input? Now, that does take trust as a manager, as a leader, as an organisation. It takes trust in your staff to say, actually, we don't mind how many hours you do, but these are your targets. These are the things we want you to achieve. So that's a way we would recommend, if possible, to head that direction. So putting that trust into your teams, into your individuals, making sure they've got support, they know how they can get hold of you, but letting them do the work in the way that suits them. So they get the output for you. You will find that if you can provide that level of autonomy and independence for people, people will more often than not rise to the challenge, and actually they'll have greater levels of engagement. They're more likely to stay with you. They're more likely to recommend you as an employer to other people. They are going to give excess effort if they know they're trusted to do so. Now, as I say, I know that doesn't always work. We can't necessarily work that way with a brand new starter who's never worked for us before, or in fact, even someone in their first job. That's probably too big a jump for those levels of autonomy. But with all the right training and support in place for them, that, in my view, should be your aim, to allow that level of autonomy so that the working hours are less of an issue, because actually it's more about the outputs that the individual achieves. And outputs, the expectations, what it is that you want from them at the end is the absolute fundamental point here. So what performance do you want? What levels of quality? What levels of output? What levels of amounts of work? What results? What KPIs are they working towards? And setting those expectations and making sure that they're all measurable is the only way you'll know how well people are doing. I've worked with managers over the years. I've had a lot of years in HR, and prior to coming into HR, I've had a lot of years as a line manager myself. I've worked with managers over the years who will come to us and say, oh, I want to get rid of this person, they're rubbish. And when you sort of try and dig a bit deeper, what is it that they're doing wrong? Well, they're just not very good at the job. And I always think, well, look, if you can't tell me what they're doing badly, have you actually told them that they're doing it badly? Have you told them what you want instead? It's all about setting those expectations. How can you expect somebody to work in a different way or work better if you've never told them what it is you want from them? So I can't overemphasize this point enough. To set those smart objectives, clear goals, clear outlines of what it is you're looking for is utterly fundamental. Because once a person knows what it is they're aiming towards, you give them the tracks to run on, you give them the support they need to remove any obstacles, but once they know where they're going, the majority of people will do a darn good job of getting towards that. And there's a saying that we sort of fling around a lot actually in our office that says people don't go to work to do a bad job on the whole. There are a few over the years I've dealt with, but on the whole, people go to work to do a good job. And if they're not doing a good job, we can quite often recognise actually that we as the managers and the leaders within that organisation, we either didn't set them the right targets or we didn't give them the right tracks to run on. We didn't give them the right support and training that they needed. So I think that when we are thinking about performance and knowing what we want from people, this is our fundamental point where we've got to set out these expectations. So questions just popped into the chat. Thanks, Mark. Heard some issues with changes in expectations from previous expectations pre-COVID to now. Yeah, and do you mean expectations from the employer, from the company, what it is they're looking for, Mark, or what people want from their companies?
Yeah, probably from both sides. If I'm honest, you kind of, and change is a big thing to manage generally, isn't it? But kind of this was the norm pre-COVID, came into the office 5 days a week. This was my desk. I sat here. Now we're moving to hot desking. You want me to be in 2 or 3 days, work at home 2 or 3 days, which is fine. But I wanted this desk. And now I don't have this desk. And little tiny things like that, people form emotional attachments to inanimate objects and don't they?
Yeah, they do. And even those that are even are generally open to change can be thrown by something small that's impacted their emotions, like you say. And I think that it comes back to the communication. So understanding what it is your individuals want. So when you're having those conversations about what our hybrid model looks like going forwards, what's really important to them. So if someone in your team says that desk is particularly important to them, is there a way to make that happen for them? It might not be a possibility because we might be downsizing our office space, etc. But is it possible? And actually, you'll only know what's going to impact them if you ask them and have that level of communication at the outset. So keep talking to them about what it is that they're looking for, how they're finding things so far, how the working from home has been for them, what changes they would think would be better for the office, what would make the office worse, what would make the office better, all those things. So the ideas they'll come up with potentially could actually be things that you've not even considered yourself. So they can come up with really good ideas. So it's really important that you do that consultation and information gathering up front as early as possible before you make any formal changes. I mean, I know last March was a sudden change when everyone rushed home from the office and set up on their dining room table, but we couldn't have planned for that. What we can do now is make sure that our future planning is done in consultation with staff and being as flexible with each individual as we can be.
And it's part of that explaining the reasons, because often people don't understand because they're not explained the reasons.
Yeah, very much so. So asking the right questions, and then when you're setting out the new way, the new world, the new process within your company, explaining why you've made that decision. So explaining that you've listened to everybody's views, you've tried your best to balance across the board. This is the financial reason for this decision. This is what we've tried to soften it here wherever possible. So absolutely, Mark, explaining why is a really key driver when we're trying to implement any sort of change. So communicating why we've had to change, get that burning platform so people understand the real reason that we've had to make a change. And at the moment, I think most people will understand why we're making changes. Yeah. You know, we've had an unprecedented 18 months, haven't we? But to then explain why we're not going back to how it was is the important point here. So absolutely communicate why we're doing it, what we're doing, the benefits for them, and listen to any blockers or concerns that they have and do your very best to solve them. So in the case of the desk, it might be as simple as that one person who doesn't like change at all has their own desk, whereas other people do hot desks because they're happy to. So it might be as simple as that. That might not be possible, but where possible, do that flexible piece to meet everybody's needs and balance the needs of the business as well as the needs of each individual. And remember that everyone in the organisation is an individual and will have a different view of this. Everyone will have had a different experience of working from home or working through COVID. Everyone will have a different view on the benefits that might come out of this. And so it's just recognising the sensitivities of each individual, I think is a really important point, and not just sort of assuming because that person's happy, then that one's going to be happy as well. It's really about remembering that each person has their own personality, their own beliefs, their own desires and their own concerns as well, of course.
Thanks.
So I think there is a really important point there that Mark raised, that we've got expectation change from both the company and from our individuals. And I don't know if anyone's heard of the Great Resignation. So there's been a big movement in the States and in particular in London as well, with resignations galore at the moment, where organisations aren't offering the flexibility that people want. So people are jumping ship and moving to somewhere that will offer them flexibility and that will give them autonomy and that will allow them to work from home 2 days a week. So actually, it's really important. This is a really great time to be trying to attract talent. But it's also a really great time to think, how can I become an employer of choice? How can I be somewhere that people want to stay? And how can we be not part of this Great Resignation? How can we keep our brilliant people? And it is all about that communication, listening and flexibility in your approach. And I think it's also all about the way you set your standards for performance, the way you measure what people are doing, the way you give them the right tools to do the job, etc. And whenever you're talking to people about standards of work, expectations of work, I know it's an oldie, but it's an oldie but a goodie. SMART objectives are so important to get into the habit of talking in this way. So every time you talk to someone about their work, make sure, mental checklist, 1, was I really simple and specific there? Is it measurable? Can they understand how to achieve? Is it achievable? Can they see the relevance? Have I explained why? And that was Mark's point. Have I explained why I want them to do this? And have I set a time scale? So we quite often think of SMART objectives for just our annual appraisal, our annual objectives for the whole year. But I think actually every single morning when you chat to someone about what they're going to do today, mental checklist, have I gone through simple, measurable, achievable? Have I explained why? Is it relevant to them? And have I set them a target, a time for it? And I've got countless examples. A really interesting example the other day where I was talking with a manager and she was saying that one of her members of staff never gets things back to her quickly enough. And I said, well, do you tell her when you want it back by? When you ask her to do it, when you delegate this piece of work, do you say when you want it back by? She said, no, because that sounds really rude if I tell her when it has to be finished by. I don't want to sound rude or aggressive. So she told me what happens. She says, like on a Wednesday, she'll say to a member of staff, oh, right, this needs doing for me. Could you get this done for me, please? Or when you get time, could you do this? And so by Wednesday night, it's not back on her desk. By Thursday morning, it's still not on her desk. So she's getting a bit twitchy now, thinking, well, where is it? Where's this piece of work that I've asked for? So by Thursday lunchtime, she does it herself, because she never told the member of staff when she wanted it back by. So now she's frustrated. She's getting really cross with herself and cross with this member of staff because all she missed at the beginning was on that email, please, could you get this piece of work done for me? I'd really like it back by Thursday lunchtime. If that's not going to be possible, please let me know. Oh, she said, yeah, that doesn't sound rude, does it, or aggressive? And maybe it would save some of the frustration. And it's such a simple thing, but I hear it so frequently that we just miss one of these steps. So just through that mental checklist, when you're asking someone to do something, when you're setting out goals, when you're setting out quality standards, have I been really clear? Can the person measure when they've done it right or when they've achieved it? Is it possible in the timescale? Have they had the right training? Have they got the right processes in place? Is the information even available for them? So is it achievable? Have I explained why? And did I tell them when it should be done by? So this is just, like I say, an oldie but a goodie, and so worth remembering in all aspects of setting conversations about work. So I want you to work 40 hours this week. That's specific. Is it specific though? I might want you to work 40 hours and they must be Monday to Friday between 9 and 5. Or I want you to work 40 hours this week and you can do them whenever you want. I don't mind. If you're a night owl, come back on at midnight for all I care. So although 40 hours sounded quite specific, it wasn't specific enough to make sure you were clear enough to set out what it is you were looking for from that individual. So it's just always worth going back and thinking, have I ticked all these boxes off? And then I've mentioned measurable a few times. Can you measure how the person's doing against your expectations? But more importantly, can they measure how they're doing? So do they know? How will they know if they're achieving what you're looking for? Or on the flip side, if they're not achieving it? Because what you don't want is to sit and get frustrated and sit and simmer and moan about it in your head and then all of a sudden sack them for it. Because actually that does no one any good. And that's another thing I've seen over the years where managers have never given any feedback about the person not achieving. And then all of a sudden it blows up and they want to sack them. So if the person can measure against a target, against a goal, then they are going to be much more engaged and motivated, recognizing when they're achieving, when they're doing well. And also they're going to understand if you give them feedback that says, you're not quite on the right track here, that isn't quite what I was looking for, it won't be a surprise to them or shock to them, because they'll have already been able to recognise that they weren't meeting your measures. It's easy in some things. How many widgets do we produce in an hour? That's an easy one to measure. How many hours do you work a week? 40 hours on the clock, easy to measure. Other things like behavioural challenges, relationship building with clients, sales isn't, building new accounts, winning new sales pitches. They're not quite so easy to measure. We can measure the inputs, did they make enough phone calls in a week? But actually, relationship building, we can't really measure that in numbers. But what we can do is find other ways to describe what we're looking for that isn't necessarily a numerical measure, but is another way of measuring. So it might be, we might measure some inputs. We might measure how many phone calls did you make to clients? How many emails did you send? But we might be able to measure it actually by doing some client satisfaction surveys. So achieving a satisfaction score of 5 out of 5 from surveys, etc. So there are other ways that we can do these measurements. And even when it's behavioural measures of targets, we can use different types of language to explain what it is we're looking for. It's not easy. It's definitely not easy, but it is possible just by thinking through, how will I know what good looks like? How can I describe what good looks like? And how can the person tell if they're doing it or not? So if there are any gaps in performance, we need to consider whether that gap between what we wanted and what we're getting, is it a significant gap? And is it a consistent gap? Off days when we don't work to our normal standards, well, over the last 18 months, we've had such an upheaval in our lives that most of us will have had more off days than normal. And that is absolutely right to make allowance for that. So people have been affected by the stress of the pandemic in general, the changing rules. People may well have had family members who've been unwell. They may have been unwell themselves and still trying to work. How many of us work through illnesses, especially when we're working from home? So supporting off days is the right thing to do. But if it's becoming more regular or significant, the performance gap between what it is you're looking for and what's happening, what the performance you're getting, you need to be able to define the issue. And this is a really important point. How can you define simply and clearly, what words will you use to say, this is what I wanted and this is what I got? If you can't define it, you're not ready to talk to the person about it. You've got to be able to explain what it was you'd asked them for and what it was you got. Check, did you actually set it out in a smart way? Was it realistic? And is there anything else that might have impacted their ability to achieve? And if you know you put all your steps in place, right, and you've still got this significant, consistent gap in performance, you need to think about following a poor performance timeline. Now, on here, we've got on the left where you identify an issue, you can define the issue. The first thing, I like to call it a cup of tea chat. It's just a really casual conversation with the individual to say, remember last week when I asked you to do this piece of work? Do you remember I said I wanted it done by Friday lunchtime? Well, I noticed actually you didn't get it to me till Monday morning. What happened? So that's how informal it is. It might be that you can solve it immediately. They might say, well, look, actually the email from so-and-so was late. I couldn't get that piece of information. It's not a performance issue at all, is it? It's fixed. Or they might just be like, oh, sorry, I forgot about the deadline. I'll do better next time. And hopefully it's fixed. Hopefully it doesn't occur again. If it does occur again, you need to move into, I've called it an informal meeting on here, but actually maybe it's a bit more structured than that. So maybe it includes you making some notes, planning out what you want to say, writing some stuff down, always just chunks up the severity, the seriousness of the meeting a little bit. So planning out how you're going to give the feedback and what objectives, what targets you're going to set for the person. Because actually these foundation stages are crucial if you're going to get into the more formal stages. And the reason for the gap in the middle of the slide there, as if by magic, is the distinction between informal processes that you just do, you and the member of staff, it's just a conversation, and then the formal process on the right-hand side is when you're going to potentially need to use disciplinary sanctions and possibly even moving towards a dismissal. So we would always say that the foundation stages have to be done and done well for a couple of reasons. One, because it's the right thing to do. It is only fair to give a person a chance to improve, to give them the feedback early on so that they know how to improve. And secondly, if you go straight in at the formal stages or straight in towards a dismissal and you've missed out those foundation stages, that's not necessarily going to be a fair dismissal. So you'll be breaking the law. You'll put yourself open to a risk of an employment tribunal, which no one wants. Now, just to reiterate, this is a performance timeline that happens whether people are in the office, whether they work from home, whether they're in a hybrid working environment, whether they've been with you for a month on a Kickstart scheme, or whether they've been with you for 30 years. It's a process, it's a best practice process that will help you solve any performance issues. It makes sure you're taking responsibility for your actions, because as the line manager, as the owner of a business, etc., you've got lots of things you must be doing to help your staff achieve. And it means that you're going to be safe from employment tribunals or claims of unfair treatment. And so it doesn't matter whether people have been with you a long time or not, whether you've got one member of staff or 100, the same process can be applied. Setting expectations, giving feedback early on, and then following these steps as needed.
Heidi, just a quick question on the, my own viewpoint is to have, lots of cups of tea or equivalent of those sort of things. But how many times do you do that? Because they might fix one issue, then something else comes up. And, what we're trying to get people to understand is at the Kickstart end of the spectrum, you might get someone who just doesn't understand the expectations of work because they haven't been in work for 30 years. They might be straight out of school, college or university, and, academic institutions a bit more lax and tolerant if you don't turn up for your lectures or don't hand your work in on time or those sorts of things, aren't they?
I think it depends on the context, if I'm honest, Mark. My personal view is if you've had a cup of tea chat with someone about a specific issue, let's say it's about turning up on time, for example, and then they're late consistently again, they're late again afterwards, you move straight into an informal meeting for me. Depending on their circumstances, you might have a second informal meeting. But actually, there's no excuse for that. If you've been really clear about the expectations, about the reasons why, you've been smart when you've set it out, there's no reason why they can't. There's nothing in the background, no mental health, no illness, no financial worries, no car broken down. There's no reason why they've been late. Then actually, I personally think the right thing to do is move step by step through the stages. Now, if it's different issues, that's a slightly different matter. So if you've had a cup of tea chat to talk to someone about being there on time, and then the next week you're talking to them about something else, and then the following week there's a different issue raised, that warrants more of your time investment, I think. And that means you would spend longer in those early stages, because actually, like you say, Mark, if someone's new to the world of work or new to your company and doesn't know how you do things and how you expect things to be done, you can't penalise them for that. That's not their fault. But what I would say is when you take someone on in the first place, that induction time should be spent you giving them all that information, you explaining all those expectations.
The reason why I say it is that's a lot of people's misconceptions or concerns around something like the Kickstart scheme or apprentices or graduates or those sort of things. They're concerned they're going to be babysitting, which isn't always the case. Our experiences of using people like you, we've given lots of good guidance on how to recruit the right people, induct them, train them, coach them, mentor them, manage them. all those sorts of things, assuming they watch and listen to the stuff that they're supposed to watch and listen to. But yeah, that's people concerned that the employer would take up more time than they're benefiting at the other side. So that's where the question comes
I
from.
think that's an interesting point, because actually in my years in HR, I've seen plenty of people who aren't first jobbers who have come from, a whole career and have still been useless. Sorry, but there are people out there that just aren't a good fit for your company. And that is going to be, I don't think it matters how old they are, how experienced they are. We are going to have people that don't fit well. But as you say, Mark, if you recruit well, you know what you want for your company, you know what the culture is, you know how much autonomy people have, you know how high your standards are. You can recruit the right person, whether they're through Kickstart or just a sort of a general employee. But recruiting the right person who you think is going to fit well into your organization and has got the right attitude, even if it's haven't necessarily got the skills as yet. It's another phrase we use a lot, is recruit for the attitude and train the skills.
Yeah,
So that's really applicable for your Kickstart scheme, isn't it, Mark?
Is kind of designed for, and that's what we encourage people to do. There's a whole webinar on it, so I won't talk on it too much, but that's what we encourage them to do, is recruit the character traits, and then you can train them up for everything else. That's the whole point of the 6 months.
Yeah.
You can find someone who's got the character traits that you think are appropriate for your business, is going to fit in with the culture, and then you can train them to do the things that you want them to do without the huge cost. Because that's why they're encouraging a scheme like this, because businesses in uncertain times like this might not be willing to take a risk, and especially take on a young person, because they think, well, it's going to cost time, it's going to cost money, and I don't know what the future's going to bring, and I'm going to have to hold their hand and all those sort of things. So it's encouraging businesses to take that risk. And often when if they've followed the advice, they've recruited the right people, they've found it's a good risk to take.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of those are being kept on, which is the ultimate, sign that they're doing something right, isn't it?
That's great to hear. Yeah, that's great to hear. I've got quite a lot of experience working with people coming through apprenticeships. And again, you recruit the right apprentice, and why wouldn't you keep them on at the end? And my overwhelming experience is that apprentices are kept on in the companies we work with, which is great to hear. We put in the training, we've recruited the right people, and I think it's a real misconception that all young people are going to need babysitting or are not going to be cut out for work. It's not. You can't generalize an entire age group of people like that. So I think it's about, like Mark says, get the interview right for the skills, the attitude that you're looking for, the behavioural attitude that you're looking for, and then train the rest in.
And would part of that recruitment process or that assessment process, if you're going to do hybrid working, make it clear your expectations, or assess, are they going to be able to do?
Absolutely. I mean, if they've just come out of uni, how did they manage? How did they cope the last year having online lessons? So how did they find it? So they're the sorts of things you'll be exploring with them. How did they cope? Are they good on the video calls? Have video call interview with them. If you're going to want them to be on video calls with your customers, you need to assess that. Can they do it? Some people have got sort of terrible anxiety around using a phone. And if we're going to be working on hybrid ways, then they're going to be able to phone people. Well, make that part of your selection process. Actually practice, get them doing phone calls, role plays, not just a standard interview.
Yeah. And there's a wider discussion about our experience of Kickstarters, is that part of the reason they're on the scheme is they don't interview very well.
Yeah.
Because to a certain extent, the ones that can blag and are extremely confident and come across in that test very well I've got the limited jobs that there are. The people that are on the Kickstart scheme, whether they've lost confidence due to COVID, or they've, the fact they've been out of work for 3 months or more, has lost confidence, or it's a wider debate around whether schools, colleges, universities prepare them properly. I mean, we have to do a load of employability training with them, but the ironic thing is they need the employability training before they get the Kickstart. Well,
to even get the Kickstart in the first place. Yeah.
Yes, we're having to explain to employers, be creative in the way that you recruit them, because your traditional interview might not get them to show what they're capable of. The,
Yeah.
the, the classic one is we get someone who's, an admin sort of role, and they're interviewing them, and they're not very good at selling themselves, and that's part of the reason maybe why they want to do admin, because that's a
Yeah.
strong, that's not a strong suit for them. We said,
Mm.
assess whether they can actually do admin rather
Yeah,
than an interview
absolutely.
well.
And we would always say, do something other than just an interview for any sort of role. It's not just about an interview, because, like you say, Mark, some people are very good at interviewing. That does not necessarily predict whether they're going to be any good at the job or not.
No, exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
it really isn't. We have an over reliance, I think, on interviews as a nation, really, as a culture, and actually some work-based tests, some functional tests, some admin tasks if they're coming for an admin role. Absolutely, you will see the person's ability. And what you're looking for when you're going through this selection process is potential, isn't it? How much is this person going to be? Are we going to be able to train this person?
Mm.
And that, I think, is the important point here, is about potential to follow some training. The willingness and the desire to learn is much more important than what they currently know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think once you've got people on board, I'll just touch on feedback briefly, because I've mentioned feedback a couple of times. This is a model that we always recommend using to give feedback to people when things haven't quite met the target. So it's always about describing in I language, so owning the language. So I saw, I noticed. We're not going to use second or third hand feedback whenever possible. It's always going to be owned by you. So what I observed in the team meeting this morning was you not speaking up. And actually the impact of that is that we didn't hear your ideas. What do you think I can do to help you speak up tomorrow when we ask for suggestions? So what happened was, another example, what happened was I asked for the report to be in with me by Friday lunchtime, and you didn't get it to me until Monday. The impact of that is that I didn't have the weekend to read it, which was my plan. So I was unprepared for my meeting on Monday. How can I help you get it to me on time next time? So the why is the important point here. And this is the bit that most people miss. We're quite good normally at telling someone what they've done wrong. Yeah. And telling them what we want them to do differently, but we're not always good at telling them why it matters. And once you've done that action and impact parts, you'll quite often find that they'll come up with a suggested desired outcome of what they're going to do differently in the future by themselves. And that's an ideal world, because actually what that's proving is that they're bought into the solution. So if you say to them, I noticed you were late with the report, that mattered because I didn't have the information I needed on time. I want you to be on time next time. Oh, that just sounds like their parents again, doesn't it? Or their teachers. So actually giving them the autonomy to say, look, I really needed that report by Friday lunchtime. The impact that you were late with it, the impact is that I didn't have the time to prepare. Give them a bit of silence. And anyone who you've recruited with the right attitude is going to jump straight in there and say, I'm really sorry, I didn't realise the importance. Next time I know I'm going to make it on time because I know why it matters now. So people will recognise that and be jumping straight in there, hopefully, with them, what they're going to do differently to solve that problem. So this is all about giving people the target, the tracks to run on to get there, and then them having the motivation to get there and do it for you, for themselves. And that's, if we've recruited the right people, they've got that motivation and that desire to achieve with us, with our support. The other thing I think is really worth just touching on when we're thinking about Kickstarters, we're thinking about any employees, we're particularly thinking about hybrid working, having really regular one-to-ones. So we would talk about a one-to-one as a fairly formal, structured meeting. It's in the diary. It's not just a chat with someone. So you might have a quick daily chat call every morning to see what work they've got on. But actually what a one-to-one is a bit more formal than that, in that it's booked in the diary. It has an agenda normally. It might touch a review on how the day-to-day progress on day-to-day work's going, how they're settling in, how are they finding that, how's their training going. There might be a review on the longer term objectives. So how are they achieving against their targets? But fundamentally, it's about them as an individual. What do they need from you? And they might need some support on their well-being. They might be struggling with their mental health. They might be struggling with working from home. They might be struggling with some aspect of the work. And your role, I think, in this part is to provide, like I say, those running tracks and that support, whatever it is they need from you, to recognise what it is they want in the longer term and how you can make your company attractive enough for them to want to stay with you. Once you've invested all, I mean, particularly with the Kickstart, once you've invested all the time in training them, you might want to keep them. So what's going to make them want to stay with you? So some interesting points about what a one-to-one could cover. You don't have to touch on all of these at every single conversation, but I think they need to be really planned, in the diary, structured. We know they're going to happen. It is the time when it's their time. It's like a mini appraisal, I suppose, but it's not just you imposing your views on them. It really is for them to talk to you about how they're finding it. And it's just as important for them to give you feedback as you to give them feedback. So what do they like about the job? How was the induction? Did they learn enough early on? Did they understand the expectations, Mark's point? Did we set out clearly enough what our culture is? Did we give them that information up front? So them to give you feedback on what's working well for them is just as useful as you giving them feedback on what they're doing well. I mentioned the word appraisals then. For those of you listening in later, if you still do appraisals, we're moving away from them. In most organisations that I work with at the moment, it's almost been thrown out the window in a lot of places. More and more companies are moving towards just having regular one-to-ones, so maybe once a month, and they take the place of those annual appraisals. So you don't need hours of preparation for an appraisal and then a couple of hours in a meeting and then typing up the notes afterwards. If you still want to use them, then fantastic. The structure's there, looking backwards, how have they performed, looking forwards, what are the targets to go forward.
Heidi, is that not a legal requirement anymore then?
No, absolutely not. Not by law. Maybe certain industries have an expectation. Maybe some governing bodies of industries might request it, but no, absolutely not. And if you were to do regular one-to-ones, let's say you do one-to-ones monthly, you're actually going to be talking in a much better way, much more efficient use of the time than saving it all up for an annual appraisal.
Yeah, I mean that's a much better thing anyway, isn't it? Because you need to get people, like you said, if they are underperforming, or even if it's the other end, people need to know before.
Oh God, you wait 11 months, they might have left. They might have, taken their talents somewhere else if they were really that good. If you've not praised and thanked them well enough, if you waited all that time, no, absolutely, you can't wait for an appraisal. And actually, I would say I'm not even sure you want to wait for a whole month for the next one-to-one. Some of this quick in the moment feedback is so valuable, whether the person's underperforming or exceeding expectations. That feedback could happen immediately. But speaking to people monthly about all the other stuff, the longer term goals, their career aspirations, what training needs they have, what training needs you suggest for them, training you might suggest for them, all those things are much better monthly. Because, let's be honest, those of us that have had an annual appraisal in the past, you have it in January, you file the bit of paper, don't you? When do you look at it next?
Yeah.
Week before the next year? Year later, the week before your next appraisal. That's just such a waste of time, isn't it? We genuinely know that people don't look at appraisal paperwork or data from year to year. So having those much more regular one-to-one conversations is so much more useful for the employee and the employer, I would suggest. Especially when we're remote, especially when we're not having those ad hoc conversations in the office, so at the coffee machine, in the lift. especially when we've got this hybrid working. We might be like ships in the night. If you're working in the office Monday and Tuesday and your member of staff's in the office Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you might not speak, you might not see each other from week to week. So it is really important that those one-to-ones are booked in, whether they're remote, doesn't matter. Happy to have them over video. I mean, God, have them by phone if you've got to, but have the conversation. The point is that the communication happens. Face-to-face is great for appraisals and one-to-ones if you can do it face-to-face. But if you can't, just make video work for you. Use the technology in the way that it's available to us. Can you imagine if we'd had the pandemic 10 years ago or 20 years ago, before we had access to the internet and emails and video conferencing? Gosh, we would have ground to an absolute halt. So let's use the right technology for the conversations, for keeping in touch with people. So it is better, normally better, our recommendation is to use face-to-face or video face-to-face when possible, because making eye contact with somebody and actually seeing them is more humanising than just speaking on a phone or sending emails. But there is absolutely a time and place for email and messenger, isn't there? So one of the things that we've done at Reality HR since we started working remotely is set up a couple of messenger chats. So we're using Microsoft Teams, but any of the platforms, Slack or whatever, any platform, doesn't matter. But for social stuff, so for the chat you would normally have in the office, or how was your weekend, where are you going on holiday, how are the kids getting on, we've just got a social channel as a chat, and we'll just stick things in there, happy birthdays, photos of the kids in the paddling pool or whatever. So just to keep that interaction with people and to not mix it up with work. So it's not to say we can have that chat during work time, but it doesn't have to then what's the word I'm looking for? We don't want it to mix up and make the work get lost. So a separate channel is a great idea.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions actually for further down the line, because if you look at things like SCARF principle and so on and so forth, that relatedness, that interaction with colleagues is a big driver for some people on why they work and why they work in a certain place, because they enjoy the people that they work with, and they, not that they sit there just gassing all day and do no work, but they go to work because it's a social thing as much as.
Absolutely, especially, yeah, I would 100% agree. It's so important to feel bought in as part of a team and have that human contact. And if we are working remotely and we've got, like I say, ships in the night in an office, it's really important that we actually recognise that as employers, as managers, we need to put in some way that teams can still chat and can still communicate informally. And it's not just all about work. So we have a virtual coffee break at least once a week. So we'll all come onto Teams and drink our cups of tea. We laugh at each other's mugs. We compare biscuits, just because that's what we would do in the office. We would make a round of teas and eat biscuits. But we do it over Teams now.
Is that partly why a hybrid model might be better for some businesses than a purely remote model? Because they'll still get some of that 2 or 3 days a week, but also get the flexibility to work from home 2 or 3 days a week, or whatever they end up doing.
Yeah, and I think it really depends on the structure of the team. So if you are a very small team and you're able to have everybody in 2 or 3 days a week, that's brilliant. That's a really lovely sort of scenario. If you're a bigger team and you're going to have some people in some days and other people in other days, you've got to make sure that those that are remote some days are not feeling left out. And that, I think, is a real challenge. So we've seen some examples recently where those in the office find out more than those that are still remote. So they get picked for the more interesting projects because they're visible more. They find out information, they bond as a team, whereas those that are still remote are now feeling excluded. So it's really important that you bear that in mind. And if you are going to have the scenario where some are in the office and some are remote still, or even some days you've got some people remote, you've got to make sure that everything you put in place encompasses everybody and works for everybody. So for example, if you're going to have a team meeting on a Monday and you've got 6 people in the office and 3 working from home that day, well, maybe you need to have that meeting online so that everyone can participate in the same way, even if they're sat in the office. If they're plugged into their screen, everyone's got their own face there, as it were, you know, so we're all interacting in the same way.
Yeah.
Because if you've got 6 of you in the office having a chat and someone dialing in, there's no way they're going to be able to get as much from the meeting or input as much into the meeting remotely as those 6 in the office. So I think it depends on the structure and the size of the team, Mark, to a certain extent, as to how you're going to structure that.
Yeah, and does a hybrid model going forward, does it then necessitate more organised social contact than, you know, this would just naturally happen, as you said, over the water cooler, or you'd go for drinks on a Thursday or a Friday, or whatever it was. But if people are only working, because I know from my own little personal experience, we've got a board that I'm a member of, been for a while, and we had quite a few new people join over the last couple of years, but we only had the first face-to-face board meeting for 18 months last week, and probably learnt more about the people that been zooming with for 15, 18 months over a meal and then a few drinks afterwards than you would that we have in the intervening 15 months.
I think to a certain extent you can account for that by, like you say, having organised social things, even if they're still over Zoom. So I know everyone's a bit zoomed out, and I know everyone's sick to death of Zoom quizzes, but there are still some fun things we can do to keep the team sort of connected. I saw an idea where everyone shared a photo of their fridge, and you had to guess whose fridge it was. I just think that's so funny, you know. So if it's still remote, we can still do silly, fun things like that and get to know about people. But I think you're right, Mark. It's more about then the planned time that we're together. So if you can schedule in regular coffee breaks over Zoom, fantastic. But actually, if you can schedule once a month a team meeting for lunch when everyone's there face to face, that's much better.
Yeah, or still do those work social things that bond your team outside of work, whether it's over a drink, a meal, a paintballing, whatever people, you know, obviously restrictions allowing, and those bits, some businesses still aren't back to, you know, reducing restrictions, are they? But yeah, I personally found I got a lot out of that face-to-face meeting. Not that we weren't functioning as a board, but it was all very kind of just, you know, you didn't get to know anyone. And
yeah, and I think getting to know people and understanding a bit more about what makes them tick will really just helps up the ante a little bit in the office, doesn't it? In the work context, you know how people are going to approach a problem, you know how people think a bit more, you understand how to solve a conflict with that person a lot better, and there'll be less conflict because you'll understand who's going to enjoy that and who's not. So those things, I think, Mark, you're right. It's not to say you weren't an effective team remotely and Zooming, but actually you can be more effective by having that social team interaction. And yeah, absolutely. If you've done face to face and that's what people want, then brilliant. So go out for drinks if that's what people want, go paintballing or whatever it is. But just with all of those celebrations, with all of those activities, it's really important to make sure that you're picking things that everyone's bought into, or you're not always doing the same thing, because actually we won't all enjoy the same thing. So if my company suggested paintballing, I wouldn't be very happy about it. It's not my cup of tea at all. But I'd go paintballing this month as long as I know next month is a posh restaurant, for example. So as long as we can take turns with it. And we just have to, with all those social aspects, we just have to be mindful of some sensitivities around preferences. So if it just involves going for drinks and you've got people in the team that don't drink for whatever reason, we've got to be careful that we're not excluding them on those grounds. If you're planning weekend or evening activities, again, be mindful that people may well have caring responsibilities, whether that be for children or elderly people. You know, if people have got caring responsibilities, are we varying the time so we're not always penalising the same people? So just some important points to think about when you're looking at socials. And with a bit of a HR legal sort of hat on, it's also important to remember that at any of those socials, people understand that they're still representing the company. So any sort of social event is an extension of the workplace. And we have to talk about this a lot at Christmas. If people are going for Christmas parties, it's really important to remind everybody that if you get drunk and punch the boss, you can still be sacked for that, even though you were in the pub. You know, it's an extension of the workplace. So that behaviour does have a bearing on all workplace rules and behaviour norms still have to remain in place. Always worth reminding people of that when there's alcohol involved. And maybe I'm being unfair here, but certainly making sure that your youngsters understand that expectation in advance, because especially if it's their first job, they won't necessarily know that. And I'm not suggesting that they're going to drink more than anyone else, but they might not know those norms and rules around the behaviour expectations in a social environment. So yeah, anything that you can do for making time for regular team contact, informal team building, going out together, Zooming together, whatever it is. So just to keep having fun, face to face whenever possible. And the other thing to think about is the nice stuff. So the little things that great teams do for each other. So for example, when it's someone's birthday, do you have birthday cakes in the office? How do you translate that if they're not in the office that day? You know, so can you send them flowers in the post? So those little things, those little touches can be really important. And it's really important when we're hybrid and or remote that we don't lose that. We don't lose that sense of connection as a team. We don't forget to celebrate some of those things. And again, if people aren't in the office, we need to make sure that they're not being treated to a detriment, so that it's not just those in the office get cake and those who are at home on their birthday get nothing. We've got to be really careful about that balance. And the last point here is something that Mark and I have both mentioned, making sure it's okay for having social chat and fun in work time, because allowing people to have a laugh, to have a chat and a banter during work time and not expecting them to make up the half an hour that they've chatted, actually that will build that relationship building, it will build the communication and it will build engagement, and you will actually get more back than you lose in that chat time. We've always had that chat in offices, we just didn't ever measure it. So now when we're working remotely or hybrid, we need to not measure it by minutes. We need to allow it to happen because it's vitally important. And I'm conscious of the time. I said I'd have too much, but we haven't got very many people on, so we're not going to have too many questions, I don't think. So I just wanted to touch on wellbeing and mental health, really, particularly important for particularly important for everybody at this moment in time, actually. We know that there's a mental health crisis happening across the UK. Something that I've heard recently is Gen Z are the generation that are the most likely to rate their mental health as fair or poor. Now, whether that's because they have got worse mental health than other generations or because they're more likely to talk about it, couldn't tell you, but they are the ones that will be open and talk about how they're feeling and what's happening for them. So it's important as a manager that you provide a supportive environment for all your employees. And the NHS recommended 5 pillars to wellbeing as an interesting model. So some of you might have heard of this. It's quite a common, well-known model that says if we allow our staff or support our staff to do these 5 things, these 5 pillars support people's well-being. And if they've got all 5 in place, they are going to be in a strong position, a resilient position when things go wrong. If we've got one of these missing, then we're a bit lopsided, our balance is out. And when things do go wrong or we're faced with challenges, we're going to struggle to bounce back from them. So as a company, it's just worth giving some mind to whether you offer opportunities for all 5 of these. So I've just talked loads about team connection, and that's exactly what we mean here about connect. Encouraging that team communication, having one-to-ones, getting to know people as individuals, building relationships, that's our connection piece. Encourage your team to be active. Maybe one of your team challenges, one of your team activities could be a step challenge. Who can do 10,000 steps a day? Who can get the most steps in a day? You know, just those sorts of silly things, but just encouraging people to be active, but also making sure that you set an example about taking a lunch break block it out in your diary, take a lunch break, go for a walk, and tell people you've been for a walk. Because actually, if you as the leader or the team leader do that, then people will know it's an ideal that they're allowed to, and they'll be encouraged to do the same. So going for a walk at lunch is a perfect one to get away from your screen and go out into nature. There's loads of benefits there. How can you consider supporting and encouraging people to keep learning? Well, you've got Kickstarters on their training, but actually, what else can you do? How can we make it fun? I don't know. Can we have a book club? Can we have cooking lessons for one of our team events? Can we all go to one of those kitchens where you all learn to cook a meal? What can you do to encourage people to keep learning? What training and development opportunities do you offer for workplace training? People who give their time or give their money, give a smile. People who give are known to be to be happier and more resilient people. So could you consider doing some charity work as a company? Do you do some fundraising? Could you give them people time off for volunteering? So those sorts of little things to allow people to give. And taking notice is quite an individual one. It's quite hard as a company to do this, but this is about being mindful. So taking notice of what's around us, particularly if we're out in nature or we're doing some meditation. So taking notice, these 5 pillars will help people build resilience and cope with the change. As Mark said, the change of no longer having a desk can be important, but it can be a real drama when it happens. But any change can be a real problem. But if we're resilient and we've got strong well-being, we're going to cope better with that change. And then I think at your one-to-ones, when you're talking to people about how they're getting on, it is just recognising and encouraging them to share any concerns they may have about their well-being or their mental health, to banish that stigma really around mental health. So knowing that you're approachable, you'll keep things confidential, and you'll signpost them to support is really all that you're expected to do. So we always say as line managers, you're not expected to be a medical professional or a counsellor or specialist in any way. It's just about providing a supportive environment and a listening ear. So if people come to you with problems about their mental health, or you ask them a question, how are you in their one-to-one? If they open up, it's just recognising that actually your role isn't to fix any problems they may be sharing. Your role is to listen. Now, if it's a work-related problem, then yeah, absolutely, you're going to talk to them about how you can solve it. So if they're struggling with feelings of isolation from working at home 5 days a week, perfect. Let's look at a hybrid model. Bring them back to the office. Put in more one-to-ones. Put in more team events. Put in more coffee and chats. But in general, when we're talking about mental health, your role isn't to solve the problems. It is just to offer support and a listening ear. So I'm conscious of the time. There's me, my contact details. I hope some of that's been useful when you're considering hybrid remote working models, particularly around young people coming into the business. I know there's so much more we could have touched on, but Mark, I know there's a whole series of webinars with other information available.
Yeah, there's loads of other stuff, and I'm sure you're doing your own webinars as well, and you've got a whole raft of support materials out there. But from my perspective and from the employers we're working with, it's really, really useful, because the amount of people that I know said they're reducing their footprint in the office. COVID has taught them that they can manage remote hybrid working better, but and probably somewhere in the middle is probably a hybrid model probably is best, because you're not stuck at your kitchen table 5 days a week, or you're not commuting 5 days, or you can people have been trying to get flexible working into employers for years, haven't they? Because people like you and the government and all those sort of things, because they know it generally makes employees happy and improves performance and all those sort of things. But the employer's perspective is, and maybe it's a bit old school now, but if I don't sit next to someone, if I'm not there to answer all their questions, if I don't check them every 5 minutes that they do, then will they do the work? That's the biggest concern, I think, for employers, is productivity, performance, all those things going to fall off.
And that's why I spent so much time talking about setting expectations. So what outcomes of work are you looking for? And have you set those out clearly enough in a way that's measurable to hold the person accountable and deal with any poor performance or underperformance if they're not managing it? I think that there was an interesting phase at the beginning of the pandemic where managers just sort of stopped managing performance. We were just all a bit like, we'll just let them, they're at home, we can't see them, we don't know what they're doing, we're just going to carry on paying them and hope for the best. And actually, as that's dragged on, I don't know about you, Mark, but we certainly were expecting 3 or 4 weeks at home last March. And, you know, now 18 months later, we've had to find ways of managing performance remotely. And those are based on, as I said, the general management principles of setting good expectations and measuring outcomes. And I think whether people are remote, hybrid, or in the office, those principles apply. But just to pick up on your point about what's right in terms of a hybrid model going forward, I think it's just this is a really exciting opportunity to understand what would be right for each person in your team, and then how do you match that to what the business needs. So when you're implementing a hybrid model, I really strongly say find out what every single person in the team would like as their perfect. Then what's the business need and how do we marry all those together? So don't just take this as an opportunity to impose, right, we've always done 5 days in the office, now we're going to do 3 in the office, 2 at home for everybody across the board. That's not necessarily going to fix anything because each person's an individual with their individual needs and desires and demands. So
I think the key lesson then is that flexibility, because as you said, some people might want to get out because they prefer coming to the office, they're a lot more effective, they don't have an hour and a half commute or whatever, and other people might prefer, you know, a bit of flexibility around doing those.
And actually there might be some people that have found they've been much more productive at home and want 5 days a week at home, and you might have to at some point say, well, look, we don't want 5 days a week from home because we do want you to be in the office, you know, once a week maybe. Or maybe it might work, maybe it does work, maybe there's some interesting research on how introverts and extroverts have worked differently working from home. And for some of us, it's been a real boost and we've done our best work, you know. It's certainly been really good for me. I've worked very well from home compared to how I was in the office. But that's just my personality type. So each individual, finding out what they want and then balancing it with the company, that's my biggest takeaway. And just manage performance in the same way, all based on the outcomes.
I think that's a really important point, marrying the two sides. It's always a difficult thing, isn't it? Okay, so thanks for your time, Heidi. If no one else has got any more questions, we'll say goodbye, and we'll let people in for the next webinar, and so on and so forth. And if you've got any more specific questions, get in touch with me. You obviously got my details because you've registered for the Eventbrite thing, or you've got Heidi's details there. So thanks a lot again, Heidi.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Really nice to speak to you. Thanks, guys, for coming on. I hope it's been useful. Cheers, everyone.
Okay, bye.